Hey guys, so what we're talking about today is the roots of representative government. So what I have behind me is the tree of government. Now later on in the year, we're going to get into specifically what the 7 principles of government are and how our Constitution came to be, how all of these documents that really affect our lives today started hundreds of years ago with the 13 colonies, which is what we're talking about today. So how this tree of government grew really begins with the foundations or the roots, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now, before representative government, people had a king or a queen that didn't represent them, but pretty much lived to legislate or make laws about what they wanted. And people really didn't have a say. But as England, things in the old world began to develop, people began to have a say. And so even when the colonies started, with Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, English citizens had an expectation that they would be represented. They had an expectation that the government would preserve their basic rights as Englishmen. And they brought those expectations with them to the colonies. And we have those same expectations today. As U.S. citizens, we expect to have things like a right to trial by jury. We expect the government to preserve our basic rights and to defend us. And that all started hundreds of years ago with some very important roots to our government, which is what I'll start going into now. Now, there were 2 very important movements that helped the ideas for these roots to really take off. And those 2 movements were the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. Now again, you should be taking notes on all of my videos, just like I taught you how to in the first video. If you forgot, go back to video 1, look at that format of Cornell notes that I asked you to take notes on. Now, those 2 movements that I was speaking of earlier were the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. Starting with the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening began in the 1730s and 1740s. It was a religious movement that swept across the colonies. Sermons appealed to people's heart and emotion and encouraged outward religious expression. One of the most famous preachers was Jonathan Edwards. He gave a very famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Let me give you an excerpt of the sermon, okay? And now you have an extraordinary opportunity, a day wherein Christ has thrown the doors of mercy wide open and stands in, calling and crying with a loud voice to poor sinners, how awful it is to be left behind on such a day. So these preachers from the Great Awakening used things like the wrath of God and God's anger to, in a way, terrify people, but with the promise that they could be saved. Now, the thing that's important about the Great Awakening is that it totally changed colonial culture. Congregations who argued over certain religious practices totally split apart. People left their old churches and joined Protestant groups. Some of the groups welcomed women, African American, Native Americans. Overall, churches gained thousands and thousands and thousands of new members. And to train ministers, which as a result were coming out of the Great Awakening, colleges like Princeton and Brown and Harvard were founded that really began to shape the American education system. Now, the Great Awakening also inspired colonists to help others. George Whitefield drew thousands of people with his sermons to raise funds, start homes for orphans. So all of these ideas of welfare and philanthropy, you can sort of see the beginnings of that, especially in the Great Awakening. Other ministers taught Christianity to Native Americans, taught them to read, taught them to write. And here's the most important part. This is what you should take notes on. The Great Awakening encouraged ideas of equality and the right to challenge authority. It encouraged ideas of equality and the right to challenge authority. Now, in this way, this movement contributed to the revolutionary fervor of the colonists, so that when they declared independence from England years later, they had this history of, emotional fervor, equality, this idea that rebelling against authority was not just okay, but was a thing of God. So we're going to add this to our roots, okay? Great Awakening. Now, the second movement was known as the Enlightenment. Now, the Great Awakening stressed religious emotion, whereas the Enlightenment emphasized reason and science. Benjamin Franklin was a famous American Enlightenment thinker. He was one of our founding fathers, very intellectual, very wealthy, very educated. And the Enlightenment began in Europe, and kind of the ideas of it slowly drifted across the Atlantic to the colonies. And scientists, began to discover during the Enlightenment is when things like, Isaac Newton discovering gravity began to happen. Other Enlightenment thinkers applied this idea of science and the natural law to human societies. Now, here is how the Enlightenment affects the roots of government. The Enlightenment encourages people to think, encourages that people have natural rights. It had natural rights, and that government had a responsibility to preserve these natural rights. Now, during the Enlightenment is when philosophers were, debating about these issues. And one of the most important philosophers to come out of the Enlightenment was John Locke. Now, he argued that people have these natural rights. What I mean by that is the right to life, liberty, and property. Does that sound familiar? Kind of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And that people create governments to protect their natural rights. If a government fails to protect your natural rights, you have a right to change it. And all of these ideas start with John Locke. Unalienable rights means they cannot be taken away. Consent of the governed means that the people have a right, have a natural right to challenge the government. And that the government has no power without the consent or agreement of the people who are being governed. Now, all of these foundations, like, the Enlightenment, which led to John Locke's thinking, the Great Awakening, which led to these ideas that people are equal and we can challenge authority, all started, and this was in the 1730s and the 1740s, but we're going to go back like 500 years, because the roots of those roots is something called the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta was the very first time you see a limit to the king's power. And since the Magna Carta was something that started in Great Britain and is very British, Charles decided that he wanted to share it with you. So, Charles, tell us about the Magna Carta. Go ahead. Is this thing on? Yes, it is, Charles. Okay, so the Magna Carta, hand me that card. You see, it's a little king. Hello, little king. So the Magna Carta limited the powers of the king, but it was written in 1215. That's like 400 years before the Great Awakening and Jamestown and all of that other stuff. And pretty much the king found himself in need of the nobles' money. Now, nobles were other people who were sort of in power, but not quite as much as the king. And what the Magna Carta really did is it gave important rights to noblemen and not just the king. For example, the noblemen could not have their rights or property seized unless the council of men agreed, and they couldn't be put on trial except, without a witness or anything, so the king just couldn't decide to chop off their heads. Now, even though the Magna Carta, which is in 1215, this should be in your notes, even though the Magna Carta was an important start of representative government, it only gave rights to the nobles, and not necessarily to everyone else. So it limited the powers of the king, and over the time, these same rights that were given to nobles were eventually given to all English people. And ideas of representative government, like Parliament, were established, and, the rest is history. So do you want to take it away? Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charles. So let's go ahead and add Magna Carta to the bottom of our tree. Again, another root or foundation of representative government. Now, as all of these roots are occurring, we still see a couple of other people whose thoughts have, been affected by this. Montesquieu is one of them. And our founding fathers, as they were writing our government, which is something that we're going to get to later on in the year, what Montesquieu argued is that the best type of government works when you separate powers. For example, okay, this group, you take this power. This group, you take this power. This group, you take this power, aka 3 branches of government. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. all three of those branches have separate powers. Sound familiar? And these were all coming from our Constitution because of ideas from Montesquieu. So do you see all of these foundations, all of these roots that are going to come into effect later as we're forming our government? Now, something else very important is that as the colonies were starting, as they were forming, you have very important things coming out of that. One of those things being the Mayflower Compact. Now, the Mayflower Compact was actually coming out of the colony of Plymouth. So if you guys have ever heard of the Mayflower, people coming over on the Mayflower, that all happened at Plymouth. And if we remember, Plymouth is 1620. Yes. Now, the Mayflower Compact is important because it's one of the first times that we really see an example of a written form of representative government, okay? So the Mayflower Compact is one of the first examples of really a written contract of government, which kind of comes into play later. Yes. And so it's really important to know about the Mayflower Compact and other important articles such as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which is yet another written form of government. Because remember, as the colonies were being established, there really wasn't any true authority the king had. I mean, yeah, at first, sure, he was totally the one in charge. But remember, guys, it took him 6, 8, 10 months to even get an answer back. And that's if, things are being really speedy. So without, a lot of sort of trouble, you weren't going to hear back from the king very soon. So in 1620, let's go back to the Mayflower Compact. 41 of the colonists who were above the Mayflower drew up the Mayflower Compact. The document refers to the area where they landed as Virginia, even though it wasn't, because the land grants of the Virginia Company, which is a joint stock company, everyone pulls their money together. Anyway, the Virginia Company extended all the way into New England. The colonists provided for self-government under majority rule. So for Mayflower Compact, you need to write down that it was one of the first examples of self-government under majority rule. So majority rule is the same type of government we have today, where we vote. And the people who vote for a certain candidate, that candidate has power. For example, the last presidential election, a majority of people voted for Barack Obama, which is why he's president. Now the fundamental orders, and again, the Mayflower Compact, we're talking 1620. Now the fundamental orders of Connecticut. That was 19 years later in 1639. Several men assembled and drew up the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Now here's what's important, write this down. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. First, written Constitution. Okay? In America. Write it down. First, written Constitution in America. Write it down. The first written Constitution in America. Okay? Don't ever forget that. Ever for the rest of your life. Now, the last thing we need to talk about is the Virginia House of Burgesses. And remember, guys, all of these are a result of all these roots I talked about at the beginning of the video. Last little section. Virginia House of Burgesses is the first representative assembly, and this comes out of Jamestown. So the first time that people said, hey, let's get together and, appoint people to talk about the problems that we're having, and let's kind of get them to decide what we should do. We'll vote for those people, and those people will represent us instead of everyone having to vote on every law. For example, in the way that our system of government works, we elect congressmen, like senators and representatives. We'll get into the details of that later in the year, but we elect those people to decide on laws for us so that we, as citizens, don't have to be educated on and know every single law every single time. So, there is, let's go ahead and add that to our tree. And all of these things together form our foundations, our roots of representative government. Make sure you have those notes for me next time. See ya.